A millionaire hired a maid to take care of his son. One day, when he returned from a business trip, he was shocked to hear the wrought iron gates groaned open, revealing the Bennett estate sprawling across acres like a fortress of wealth and solitude. Rachel Miller tightened her grip on the fraying strap of her canvas bag. Her worn flats crunched against the gravel as she stepped out of the taxi, her breath catching at the sight before her. The mansion stood like an imposing sculpture of stone and glass, its pristine facade reflecting the sunlight in flashes of silver. Despite the grandeur, the silence surrounding it felt suffocating, as though the estate itself were holding its breath. Rachel wiped her damp palms on her skirt and squared her shoulders. Just another job, she murmured to herself, though the doubt gnawed at her confidence. Inside the foyer, the air was cool, faintly scented with polish and lilies. The polished marble floors gleamed under an elaborate chandelier, its crystals catching the light in a dazzling display. She could feel the weight of the house's gaze on her, an almost palpable judgment from every corner. From the staircase, a small figure peeked out, then ducked back into the shadows. Rachel caught a glimpse of wide, curious eyes. Her lips curled into a faint smile. That must be Sean, she thought, but there was no time to linger. Miss Miller. A clipped voice broke the silence, and Rachel turned to see a woman in her late 60s descending the stairs. Margaret Bennett moved with the kind of precision that commanded respect or fear. Her tailored navy suit fit her perfectly, as did the coldness in her pale blue eyes. She surveyed Rachel with an expression that was unreadable, but unmistakably assessing. "You're early," Margaret noted, her tone betraying neither approval nor disapproval. Rachel nodded. "I thought it best to arrive promptly, ma'am." Margaret's gaze lingered a moment too long. "This way," she said, turning sharply on her heel. The click of her heels on the marble was the only sound as Rachel followed her through the cavernous halls. They entered a study that was both grand and sterile, dominated by a mahogany desk and a wall of bookshelves that seemed more decorative than functional. Behind the desk sat Jackson Bennett, tall and composed, his tailored suit emphasizing his air of authority. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp, studying Rachel with the same intensity Margaret had. "Miss Miller." Jackson's voice was calm, detached. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Rachel sat, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Bennett." The interview began with formalities. Jackson asked about her experience, her education, and her willingness to adapt to Sean's needs. His questions were precise, like a scalpel slicing through pretense, but Rachel responded with equal clarity, her words steady despite her pounding heart. "I understand Sean has been through a lot," Rachel said carefully, her tone softening. "Children need stability and someone who truly listens to them. I've worked with families who... And what makes you think you'll succeed where others have failed?" Jackson interrupted, his tone clinical but not unkind. Rachel paused, her fingers gripping the edge of her bag. "Because I'm not just here for a paycheck, Mr. Bennett. I want to make a difference, and I believe Sean deserves that." For the first time, Jackson's gaze faltered, his lips pressing into a thin line as though her words had struck a chord. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Before he could respond, a faint rustle drew their attention. At the door, Sean peeked out again, his face partially obscured by the doorframe. Rachel met his gaze and smiled softly, lifting her hand in a small wave. The boy hesitated, then ducked back out of sight. "He's shy," Rachel murmured, her tone warm but without pity. Jackson nodded. "He's been reserved since his mother passed." Margaret, who had remained silent during the exchange, stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. She watched Rachel closely, as though searching for something specific. Then her expression shifted ever so slightly, Something between recognition and unease flickered in her eyes. Does she know? Margaret thought, her jaw tightening. Rachel's high cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. It was as if that shameless woman were standing before her, years peeled back like old paint. The resemblance was uncanny. Too uncanny. Miss Miller, that will be all for now, Margaret said abruptly, her voice cutting through the tension. Jackson and I will discuss your application. Rachel stood, inclining her head. Thank you for your time. As she left, she thought she felt Margaret's gaze drilling into her back. In the quiet of the study, Jackson broke the silence. She's competent. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, her eyes still fixed on the door where Rachel had exited. She'll do, she finally said, her tone distant. But inside, her unease churned, an old wound threatening to reopen. The slow pacing and focus on rich description and character interaction aimed to build tension subtly while giving readers a sense of Rachel's arrival and the dynamic between her and the Bennets. The sun poured through the towering windows of the Bennet estate, casting long streaks of gold across the hardwood floors. Rachel knelt beside Sean, her hands guiding his as they moved a crayon across the heavy paper. The boy sat cross-legged, his small frame hunched in concentration. A faint smile tugged at his lips as the bright blue of the ocean took shape beneath his fingers. What do you think, Miss Rachel? Sean's voice was quiet, but eager, his eyes lifting to meet hers. Rachel leaned in, pretending to scrutinize the picture with exaggerated seriousness. I think, she began, tapping her chin, that this is the best ocean I've ever seen. But doesn't an ocean need fish? Sean giggled softly, his laugh carrying the hesitant lilt of a child, still learning to trust. You're right, he exclaimed, and reached for the green crayon. Margaret's voice broke the moment, sharp and cutting from the doorway. Sean, don't slouch, sit up properly. The boy stiffened, his giggle evaporating as quickly as it had come. Rachel looked up to see Margaret standing with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin line. The older woman's presence filled the room with an unspoken weight. Of course, Mrs. Bennet, Rachel said, keeping her tone even. She gently placed a hand on Sean's back, encouraging him to straighten without making a scene. Margaret's gaze flickered to Rachel, and for a brief second, the older woman's expression softened. But it was gone before Rachel could be sure she had seen it. Without another word, Margaret turned and disappeared down the hall, the clicking of her heels fading into silence. Later that evening, Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor of Sean's room, a well-worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit in her lap. Sean lay sprawled on his bed, the weight of the day making his eyelids droop. So, the rabbit asked, what is real? Rachel read, her voice low and soothing. She paused and glanced up at Sean. What do you think, Sean? What makes something real? The boy blinked sleepily, considering her question. When someone loves you, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. That's exactly right. She closed the book quietly as Sean's breathing slowed, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. The next morning, Rachel found Margaret in the kitchen, meticulously arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. Rachel hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should interrupt. Good morning, Mrs. Bennet, she said finally, stepping inside. Margaret's hands paused for a fraction of a second before resuming their task. Miss Miller, she replied, her tone brisk. I trust Sean is ready for breakfast. Yes, ma'am, Rachel said, keeping her voice steady. He's washing up now. He's excited about the story he's going to tell you about the ocean we drew yesterday. Margaret's lips thinned. A waste of time, if you ask me. He needs discipline, not distractions. She placed the vase on the table with precision and turned to Rachel, her gaze as cold as the marble counters. Rachel swallowed her instinctive reply, choosing instead to nod politely. "I'll make sure he's ready for his lessons after breakfast." As Margaret swept past her, Rachel exhaled slowly. The older woman's sharp remarks were beginning to feel less like passing comments and more like calculated tests, each one designed to find a flaw in Rachel's resolve. Jackson observed all of this from a quiet distance. That afternoon, he stood on the patio, his phone in one hand and his eyes on the garden below. Rachel kneeled in the grass, helping Sean tie the strings of a kite. The boy was laughing again, his small hands clumsy but determined. The sound was lighter than Jackson had heard in months. He ended the call and stepped closer to the edge of the patio, his eyes narrowing as he studied Rachel. There was something about her patience, her unwavering focus on Sean, that unsettled him. She wasn't just doing her job, she was reaching his son in ways no one else had. When the kite finally lifted into the sky, Sean let out a triumphant cheer. Rachel's laughter joined his, the sound carrying on the wind. Jackson's guarded expression softened, if only slightly, before he turned back inside. That night, as Rachel climbed the stairs to her room, she caught sight of Margaret standing in the hallway, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The older woman's eyes followed Rachel's movements, cool and unreadable. "Good night, Mrs. Bennet," Rachel said, her tone warm but cautious. Margaret inclined her head slightly, saying nothing. As Rachel disappeared into her room, Margaret remained where she stood, her fingers tightening on her sleeves. The resemblance, the sharp curve of Rachel's cheekbones, the quiet determination in her eyes, was impossible to ignore. It was as though the past had come back to haunt her, draped in the unassuming kindness of the young woman who now occupies her home. The morning air hung thick with the scent of roses as Margaret stood at the edge of the garden, her gaze fixed on Rachel and Sean. Rachel was seated cross-legged on the lawn, her hair catching the light as she leaned toward Sean, who was busy inspecting a butterfly perched on his hand. Margaret's fingers tightened around the handle of the watering can she had no intention of using. It was the way Rachel moved, the tilt of her head, the gentle curve of her smile. Margaret's chest tightened. She had seen that same grace before, years ago, in a sunlit room filled with laughter that was not hers. The memory came unbidden later that afternoon, as Margaret sat in the quiet of her study. The room, lined with shelves of unread books, seemed smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She remembered the day she had walked into Gabriel's office unannounced, her heart already bracing for the worst. Barbara had been there, perched on the corner of his desk, her laughter spilling out like syrup, thick and cloying. Margaret hadn't needed an explanation. The scene spoke for itself. "You've ruined everything," she had spat, her voice trembling but sharp. Barbara had met her gaze, unapologetic and poised, her beauty unyielding. Gabriel had stood between them, his silence louder than words. The memory shifted, and Margaret saw herself years later, standing on a stranger's porch. Barbara had opened the door, a toddler clinging to her leg. "Stay away from my family," Margaret had said then, her voice cold and unyielding. Barbara's eyes had flashed with something that looked like pity, but she had said nothing. And now, here she was. Margaret could see her in Rachel's every move, every glance. The resemblance was undeniable. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself watching Rachel more closely, though she made sure her scrutiny was subtle. Rachel remained unaware, her focus on Sean. One afternoon, Margaret walked past the open door of the playroom and paused, drawn by the sound of Rachel's voice. She stood just out of sight, the edge of her shawl brushing the doorframe. "And then," Rachel was saying, her tone animated, Mum and I would make pancakes for dinner. It wasn't fancy, but it was fun. She'd flip them way too high sometimes, and we'd both laugh when they hit the floor. Sean giggled, his laughter clear and unguarded. "Did you clean it up?" he asked. "Of course," Rachel replied. "But only after we took a picture of the mess. She'd always say, 'You've got to remember the funny moments.'" Her voice softened, and Margaret could hear the affection in her words. "She worked so hard, Sean. Every single day." Margaret felt something cold slide through her chest. Barbara had worked hard too, hard enough to disrupt another woman's life. She turned and walked away before Rachel could say anything more. That evening, the unease in Margaret's chest refused to settle. She joined Jackson in the sitting room, where he was skimming through reports with the same intensity he brought to everything. Margaret cleared her throat, and he glanced up, surprised to see her lingering. "She's good with Sean," Margaret said, her voice deliberately even. Jackson set the papers aside, his brow furrowed. "Rachel? Yes, she is. He's different around her. Happier." Margaret pressed her lips together. "Perhaps too good," she murmured, almost to herself. Jackson straightened. "What does that mean?" Margaret waved a hand dismissively, but the tension between them lingered like a shadow. "Just be careful, Jackson," she said finally, rising to her feet. "We've had enough surprises in this family." The following morning, Rachel found herself in the kitchen again, slicing fruit for Sean's breakfast. Margaret entered, her movements as deliberate as ever. Rachel offered a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Bennet." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice clipped. "Miss Miller, you seem to enjoy telling Sean stories about your childhood." Rachel paused, unsure if this was an accusation or a casual remark. "He likes hearing them," she replied cautiously. "I think it helps him feel less alone." "Does it?" Margaret's tone was unreadable. She stepped closer, her gaze searching Rachel's face as though looking for answers hidden beneath her skin. Rachel swallowed, her hands gripping the counter. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Bennet?" For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she shook her head, her expression smoothing into one of practiced indifference. "No, nothing at all." But as Margaret left the kitchen, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she had just failed a test she didn't know she was taking. Margaret retreated to her study, closing the door behind her. She stood at the window, staring out at the garden, where Sean and Rachel had drawn the ocean days before. The child's laughter echoed faintly in her ears, but all she could see was Barbara's defiant smile and the child she had once held on her hip. The resemblance wasn't just physical. It was in Rachel's warmth, her resilience, and the way she seemed to breathe life into the world around her. Margaret's hand tightened on the windowsill. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The past, it seemed, had found its way back to the Bennet estate, and Margaret was determined to uncover exactly how. The sound of pencil strokes filled the air as Sean carefully worked on his drawing, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Rachel sat beside him on the floor of the playroom, her legs folded beneath her as she watched him with quiet encouragement. "There," Sean said proudly, holding up his masterpiece. It was a brightly colored picture of two figures, one taller with flowing hair and the other smaller, clutching what appeared to be a kite. Above them, a cheerful sun beamed down on a green hill. Rachel took the picture with exaggerated reverence, holding it as though it were a precious artifact. "Is this us, Sean?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded, a shy grin spreading across his face. "It's you and me. You helped me fly the kite." Rachel's chest tightened, warmth blooming in her at his words. "This is beautiful," she said, her tone sincere. "I'm going to keep it forever." Sean beamed, his cheeks turning pink. "Really?" Really? Rachel replied, setting the drawing carefully on the low table beside her. But next time, you'll have to teach me how to draw like this. You're an artist. The boy giggled, his laughter light and free, filling the room with an ease that was rare in the grand, cold house. Margaret watched the exchange from the hallway, her shadow falling just short of the doorway. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her nails pressing into her palms. Rachel's smile, her gentle encouragement, it was maddeningly familiar. Margaret stepped into the room, her presence as sharp as a blade, slicing through the easy atmosphere. "Sean," she said curtly, "have you finished your arithmetic for today?" Sean's smile faltered, and he looked down at the pencils scattered across the floor. "Not yet, Grandma." Margaret's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Rachel before flicking back to Sean. "Then I suggest you do so now. You know better than to neglect your studies." "Yes, Grandma," Sean murmured, gathering his pencils without looking up. Rachel rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt. "I'll help him with it after lunch," she offered, keeping her tone polite but firm. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "You'll make sure it's done thoroughly," she said, her words clipped. "No shortcuts, Miss Miller." Rachel nodded. "Of course." Margaret turned sharply on her heel, her steps echoing down the hall. Rachel let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing, only after the sound of Margaret's retreat had faded entirely. Later that evening, Rachel found Jackson in the garden, leaning against the stone balustrade with a glass of whiskey in hand. The golden light of the setting sun painted the scene in warm hues, softening the sharp edges of his features. "Mr. Bennet," Rachel called softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, his brow lifting slightly in surprise. "Miss Miller," he replied, setting his glass down. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Rachel said, stepping closer. "I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to work here. Sean is a wonderful boy." Jackson studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "He's been through a lot," he said finally. "It's good to see him laughing again." Rachel smiled faintly. "He's an incredible child. He just needed someone to listen." Jackson nodded, the corners of his mouth softening in what could almost be called a smile. "And you seem to be good at that." Rachel tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Was he always so quiet?" Jackson hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. "Not always. It's just been difficult since my wife passed." Rachel said nothing, sensing the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. Instead, she looked out at the garden, the flowers swaying gently in the evening breeze. "You're good with him," Jackson said, after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "Better than I expected." Rachel turned back to him, her expression warm but careful. "Thank you, Mr. Bennet. That means a lot." The next morning, Margaret handed Rachel a list of tasks, longer than usual. "These need to be done before dinner," she said, her tone brisk. "I trust that won't be an issue." Rachel glanced at the list, her stomach sinking slightly at the sheer volume. But she met Margaret's gaze steadily. "I'll make sure it's done." Margaret's eyes lingered on her, cold and assessing. "Good." As the older woman walked away, Rachel exhaled quietly, rolling up her sleeves. The hours that followed were grueling, cleaning the linen closet, polishing the silverware, and arranging fresh flowers for the sitting room. But Rachel worked without complaint, her resolve unwavering. That evening, Rachel tucked Sean into bed, his drawing folded carefully in her apron pocket. She smoothed the blanket over his small frame and sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the mattress. "Miss Rachel?" Sean's voice was soft, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Yes, Sean." "Are you going to stay here forever?" he asked, his words slurring slightly. Rachel's chest tightened, but she forced a smile. "For as long as you want me to." Sean smiled faintly, his eyes fluttering shut. "Good," he murmured, slipping into sleep. Margaret moved through the silent house with purposeful precision, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs that lined the hallway. In her hand, she carried an empty envelope, though its purpose was anything but innocent. The past week had only deepened her unease, each interaction with Rachel leaving her more convinced that the young woman was not who she seemed, or perhaps exactly who Margaret feared she was. She entered Rachel's room quietly, the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air. The space was modest and tidy, a reflection of Rachel's unassuming nature. Margaret's gaze swept the room before settling on the dresser, where a hairbrush lay. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and picking it up. Her movements were swift and deliberate as she slipped it into the envelope and tucked it into her pocket. The next stop was Jackson's bathroom. Collecting stray hair from his comb was easier, though the act left her with a hollow pit in her stomach. Margaret justified her actions as she descended the stairs toward the study. The truth needed to be uncovered, whatever the cost. Meanwhile, Rachel knelt in the garden with Sean, her hands buried in the soil as they planted marigold seeds. The boy giggled as Rachel exaggerated the importance of each step, holding up a seed as if it were the crown jewel of the garden. "This one," Rachel said in a mock-serious tone, "is the king of the marigolds. We must plant him right in the middle so he can rule the others." Sean laughed, his small hands reaching out to press the seed into the soil. "And this one is the queen," he declared, carefully placing another seed nearby. "Perfect," Rachel said, her smile warm. "They'll grow strong together." As they worked, Rachel felt a shadow pass over her. She glanced up to see Margaret standing at the edge of the garden, her expression as unreadable as ever. The older woman's gaze lingered on the two of them before she turned and walked back toward the house, without a word. Sean noticed too. "Grandma doesn't like planting flowers," he said quietly. Rachel wiped her hands on a cloth, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe she just prefers to look at them when they're all grown up." Sean shrugged, his attention already back on the soil. Rachel sighed softly, the tension lingering even as the boy's laughter resumed. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, the envelope resting on her desk like a loaded gun. She stared at it for a long time before picking up the phone and making the call. Her voice was steady as she arranged for the samples to be tested, though her heart raced with an intensity that unsettled her. Rachel felt the tension more acutely in the days that followed. Margaret's instructions grew more demanding, her comments sharper. One afternoon, Rachel found herself reorganizing the pantry for the third time that week. She bit her lip to keep from snapping when Margaret hovered in the doorway, her critical eye taking in every movement. "Make sure the labels are all facing forward," Margaret said. "It's not difficult." "Yes, Mrs. Bennet," Rachel replied, keeping her voice calm. Margaret's lips thinned. "Good." As soon as Margaret left, Rachel slumped against the counter, her fingers rubbing her temples. The woman's hostility was becoming harder to endure, though Rachel reminded herself why she was here. Sean needed her, and that was enough. Jackson had noticed the growing tension too. One evening, he found Rachel in the library, a stack of books in her arms as she searched for Sean's bedtime story. "Miss Miller," he said, startling her. The books wobbled, and he reached out instinctively, steadying them with one hand. "Apologies," he said with a faint smile. Rachel exhaled, her laugh soft. "It's all right. I'm just trying to find something new for Sean." Jackson nodded, his eyes scanning the titles she held. "He seems happier lately." Rachel tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "He's an incredible boy. I think he just needed someone to spend time with him." Jackson's expression shifted, a flicker of something unspoken crossing his face. "You've done well with him," he said, his voice quieter. "Better than most." Rachel hesitated, sensing the rare sincerity in his words. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. That means a lot." For a moment, their eyes met, and Rachel felt a flicker of warmth beneath Jackson's typically formal demeanor. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, and he stepped back. "Good night, Miss Miller," he said, his tone reverting to its usual professionalism. "Good night, Mr. Bennett," Rachel replied, watching him leave. In the quiet of her room that night, Rachel thought back to the day's small victories, the marigold seeds with Sean, Jackson's brief but genuine acknowledgement. Yet Margaret's shadow lingered, an unshakable presence that pressed against her resolve. Down the hall, Margaret lay awake in her own bed, the weight of the envelope heavy in her thoughts. The truth was out there, waiting to be revealed, and Margaret knew that once it was, there would be no turning back. The envelope arrived 2 days later, its ordinary appearance believing the power of the truth it held. Margaret sat in her study, the document trembling slightly in her hands as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the lines of text, each word digging into her like shards of glass. Positive match. The paper fell to her lap. Margaret's breathing was shallow as she stared at the ornate rug beneath her feet, its intricate design blurring. Rachel wasn't just some girl with a passing resemblance to Barbara. She was Gabriel's daughter, the tangible result of his betrayal, now living under the same roof. For a long moment, Margaret didn't move. The betrayal she thought she had buried years ago surged to the surface, bitter and raw. Barbara's defiant face swam in her mind, the memory taunting her. Now, Barbara's child was here, working in her house, bonding with her grandson, weaving herself into their lives like she belonged. Margaret clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Something had to be done. Rachel sensed a shift almost immediately. Margaret's instructions became sharper, her tone icier. Tasks piled up, each more tedious than the last. Rachel worked through them with quiet determination, but the tension gnawed at her. Something had changed, but she couldn't pinpoint what. Was this story sent to you on a rainy or sunny day? A cold or warm day? Why not leave a comment about the weather where you live? We hope you are living in a peaceful and happy place. One afternoon, Rachel was helping Sean with his schoolwork in the playroom. The boy was cheerful as always, his laughter lighting up the room as they worked through math problems. Rachel smiled at his progress, but the moment was interrupted by Margaret's entrance. "Sean," Margaret said, her voice as cold as the draft that followed her, "you're late for your piano lesson." Sean frowned. "But Grandma, Miss Rachel said—" "I don't care what Miss Rachel said," Margaret interrupted, her gaze cutting toward Rachel. "You need discipline, not distractions." Rachel's stomach twisted, but she kept her voice even. "I'll make sure he's ready, Mrs. Bennett." Margaret didn't reply. She lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she watched Rachel with a gaze that felt almost accusatory, before turning and walking away. Rachel exhaled slowly, her hands tightening around the pencil she held. "Come on, Sean," she said gently, forcing a smile. "Let's get you ready." Later that evening, Jackson announced he'd be leaving on a short business trip. Rachel stood in the doorway of the dining room, listening as he spoke to Margaret over dinner. His voice was calm as usual, but there was a warmth in his tone when he mentioned Sean that made Rachel smile. Margaret's response was clipped. "Of course. We'll manage here." Rachel turned to leave, missing the glance Margaret threw her way, sharp and deliberate. The day Jackson left, Margaret struck. "Miss Miller," Margaret said, her voice echoing through the cavernous hall. Rachel turned to see Margaret standing at the foot of the grand staircase, her posture stiff and imposing. "Yes, Mrs. Bennet?" Rachel asked, setting aside the basket of linen she'd been carrying. Margaret's expression was stone. "Your services are no longer required. Pack your things and leave by this evening." The words hit Rachel like a blow. For a moment, she was too stunned to speak. I don't understand," she managed finally. "Have I done something wrong?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't a discussion. You're not suited for this household, Miss Miller. That is all." Rachel's breath caught. "But Sean will adjust," Margaret said sharply, cutting her off. "Your presence here is no longer appropriate." Rachel's eyes burned, but she blinked back the tears, threatening to spill. She straightened her back, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I understand. I'll be gone by evening." Margaret said nothing more, turning and disappearing up the staircase. Rachel stood frozen for a moment before gathering herself and retreating to her room. Packing was harder than Rachel expected. She moved through the small space, her hands lingering on Sean's drawing pinned to the wall. She carefully folded it, slipping it into her bag with her few belongings. Her mind raced, searching for answers she didn't have. Why had Margaret turned against her so suddenly? What had she done to deserve such hostility? Sean ran to her as she descended the stairs with her bag in hand. "Miss Rachel, are you leaving?" His voice wavered, his eyes wide and glassy. Rachel knelt down, brushing a hand through his hair. "I have to go, Sean. But you'll be all right, won't you? You're strong and smart." Tears welled in his eyes. "But I don't want you to go." Rachel swallowed hard, her own tears threatening to spill. "I'll miss you too," she whispered. "So much. But you're going to do great things, Sean. I know it." He threw his arms around her and she held him tightly, memorizing the warmth of his small frame. When Margaret appeared in the doorway, Rachel gently pulled back, offering Sean a shaky smile before standing. Without another word, Rachel walked out of the Bennet estate, her heart heavy with confusion and grief. The grand doors closed behind her with a finality that echoed in her chest. Margaret stood by the window, watching as Rachel disappeared down the driveway. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them tightly together. The weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders, but she told herself it was necessary. It had to be. But as Sean's muffled sobs drifted through the hall, Margaret couldn't shake the growing doubt curling at the edges of her resolve. The Bennet estate was eerily silent in the days after Rachel's departure. The absence of her laughter with Sean, the soft hum of her voice as she read to him, and the quiet grace of her presence seemed to amplify the coldness that already lingered within its walls. Sean's sorrow was palpable. He barely touched his breakfast the next morning. The cheerful stack of pancakes he once adored left untouched. When Margaret urged him to play outside, he simply shook his head and clutched the drawing he'd made for Rachel, his small hands gripping it tightly as though it might bring her back. Jackson returned that evening, his suitcase left forgotten by the front door as he noticed the shift in the house. The staff seemed quieter, avoiding his gaze as though they carried secrets too heavy to share. He found Sean curled up in his room, the boy's face buried in his knees. "Sean," Jackson said softly, crouching down to his level. "What's wrong, buddy?" Sean lifted his head, his tear-streaked face breaking Jackson's heart. "Miss Rachel's gone," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Grandma made her leave." Jackson's jaw tightened. "What?" Sean handed him the drawing, the paper wrinkled and dampened from being held too tightly. "She said she had to go." Jackson stormed into the study where Margaret sat by the window, a cup of tea in her hand. The soft light of dusk cast shadows across her face, making her appear both weary and unyielding. "Why is Rachel gone?" Jackson demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Margaret didn't flinch, her eyes remaining fixed on the garden outside. "She wasn't suitable for this household." Jackson's fist clenched at his side. "That's not an answer. Sean's devastated. What did she do?" Margaret finally turned to face him, her expression carefully controlled. "It's not about what she did. It's about who she is." "What does that even mean?" Jackson asked, his voice rising. "She was good for Sean and for this family. Why would you throw her out?" Margaret rose from her chair, setting the teacup down with deliberate precision. Her gaze met Jackson's, and for a moment, there was something raw in her eyes. Anger, pain, and something else he couldn't quite name. "She's Gabriel's daughter," Margaret said, her words landing like a thunderclap in the room. Jackson froze, the weight of her revelation pressing down on him. "What?" he breathed. Margaret crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I had the DNA tested. She's his child. Barbara's child." Jackson's mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, stolen glances, and Rachel's quiet humility. It all made sense now. Her uncanny resemblance to Barbara, the way Margaret's demeanor had shifted so abruptly, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though no less charged. "What would it have changed?" Margaret snapped, her composure cracking. "She had no right to be here, Jackson. Not after what her mother did. Do you know what it's like to have someone walk into your life and tear it apart, to see the proof of that betrayal every day?" Jackson looked at his mother, her pain etched into every line of her face. For the first time, he saw the depth of the scars Gabriel's infidelity had left on her. But beneath his empathy for her suffering was a growing ache for Rachel, thrust into the storm, without even knowing why. "She didn't ask for this, Mother," Jackson said finally, his voice steady. "She didn't choose who her parents were." Margaret's gaze faltered, the bitterness in her eyes dimming slightly. "And neither did I," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I had to live with it. With him. With her." Jackson exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He felt caught in the crossfire of two truths: Margaret's pain and Rachel's innocence. "You didn't have to punish her," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Not like this." Margaret turned back to the window, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the sill. "It was the only way to protect this family," she said, though even she didn't sound convinced. Jackson stood there for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with unresolved pain. "This family," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of his disappointment, "is falling apart." Without another word, he left the study, his footsteps echoing down the hall. That night, Jackson sat in Sean's room, the boy asleep beside him. He held the drawing Sean had given him earlier, tracing the lines of Rachel's figure with his finger. His chest tightened as he thought of her kindness, her patience, the way she had brought light back into Sean's life, even if only for a brief moment. He knew he had to find her, not just for Sean, but for himself. The truth Margaret had revealed had shaken him, but it hadn't changed what he felt in his heart. Rachel didn't deserve to bear the weight of her parents' mistakes, and she certainly didn't deserve to be cast aside like a piece of unwanted history. The decision settled in him like a stone sinking to the bottom of a pond. Tomorrow, he would go to her. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he couldn't let this be the end. The drive to Rachel's home was a blur of rolling hills and narrow roads, but Jackson barely noticed the scenery. His mind replayed fragments of conversations, Sean's tear-streaked face, and Margaret's cutting words. She didn't ask for this. The thought thudded in his chest as he turned down the final stretch of road, a gravel path leading to a modest single-story house. Jackson parked a short distance away, his hesitation pulling him into stillness. From where he sat, he could see Rachel through the window, her figure moving about the kitchen. There was no joy in her posture, no lightness in her step. He hadn't thought it possible, but she looked even smaller, more burdened than when she'd been at the Bennett estate. A frail cough broke his focus, drawing his attention to the porch. An older woman, Barbara, sat in a creaky chair, a blanket draped over her lap, despite the warmth of the afternoon. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted a mug to her lips, and Jackson could see the sharpness of her collarbones through her faded sweater. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. Barbara turned her head, her eyes narrowing in confusion as he approached. "Good afternoon," Jackson said, his voice careful and calm. "I'm Jackson Bennett." Recognition flashed across her face, followed quickly by something guarded. "You're her employer," she said, her voice rasping with effort. "Or you were." Jackson nodded, his hands sliding into his pockets to steady himself. "I came to see Rachel. I wanted to make sure she's all right." Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced toward the window, where Rachel was still moving about, oblivious to the visitor outside. "She's strong," Barbara said after a moment, her tone both proud and sad. "Stronger than she should have to be." Jackson's throat tightened as he looked at her. The signs of illness were unmistakable, the pallor of her skin, the slight wheeze in her breath. Rachel had carried all of this quietly, without complaint, while working tirelessly to care for Sean. The weight of it settled heavily on him. "Does she know I'm here?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why he hesitated. Barbara shook her head. "She doesn't need more on her plate," she said firmly. "She already blames herself for enough." Jackson nodded, understanding her protectiveness. He took a step back, his gaze lingering on the house. "Thank you," he said softly, before returning to his car. Rachel appeared moments later, stepping onto the porch with a tray of tea. "Who was that, Mum?" she asked, setting the tray down. Barbara shook her head, her expression unreadable. "Just someone passing through." The drive back to the Bennett estate was heavy with guilt and unease. Jackson replayed the sight of Rachel in the kitchen, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He thought of Barbara, frail but fiercely protective. He thought of Sean, clutching his drawing with a quiet despair that no child should know. When he returned home, he found Margaret in her usual spot by the window in the study. The sight of her, poised and immovable, stirred an anger in him he hadn't expected. "I went to see her," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Margaret turned, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" "Rachel," he said firmly. "I went to see her. I saw how she's living and how her mother is sick and barely holding on." "Do you even care about what you've done?" Margaret's face tightened, her composure cracking for just a moment before she regained control. "She doesn't belong here," she said stiffly. "She's a reminder of everything this family has endured." "She's not responsible for Gabriel's mistakes," Jackson shot back, his voice rising. "She didn't choose to be born into this. She didn't choose any of it." Margaret's lips thinned, but Jackson pressed on. "She's struggling, Mother. Struggling to take care of a dying parent, and still found a way to bring light into Sean's life, into this house. And you threw her out like she was nothing." Margaret's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly together. "You think I don't know what it's like to struggle?" she snapped. "To carry the weight of someone else's choices? I've done it for decades, Jackson." Jackson's anger simmered, but his voice softened. "Then you should understand, better than anyone, what Rachel's going through. Instead, You punished her for something she couldn't control. Margaret turned back to the window, her shoulders stiff, but her expression wavering. You don't understand what it's like, she said quietly. To see her face, her mannerisms. It's like watching Barbara all over again. Rachel is not Barbara, Jackson said firmly, and Sean is the one paying the price for your grudge. Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. The room fell into silence, the tension between them thick and unresolved. As Jackson left the study, Margaret remained by the window, staring out at the garden. Doubt crept into her thoughts, intertwining with the bitterness that had fueled her decision. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The decision to confront Rachel wasn't one Margaret made lightly. Jackson's words echoed relentlessly in her mind, chipping away at her resolve until she could no longer ignore the gnawing guilt. Early the next morning, she stood in the foyer, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I'll take you there," Jackson said, his voice steady but devoid of the warmth she was used to. His disappointment lingered in every syllable. Margaret nodded, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on her chest. The drive was silent, the only sound being the hum of the car's engine as they wound through narrow roads and sprawling fields. Margaret stared out the window, her mind tumult of memories. Barbara's face haunted her, the smugness she had worn so effortlessly. Now, she was about to face her again, or what was left of her. When they arrived, the house seemed even smaller than Jackson had described, its faded paint and weathered structure a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Bennett estate. Margaret hesitated at the gate, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed it open. Barbara was seated on the porch, her blanket draped over her lap as usual. When she looked up and saw Margaret, the mug in her hands slipped, shattering against the wooden planks. "You?" Barbara rasped, her voice thick with disbelief. Margaret's heart thudded in her chest. The years had etched lines of hardship into Barbara's face, but the recognition between them was immediate and undeniable. "Hello, Barbara," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. Barbara clutched the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. "What are you doing here?" Before Margaret could answer, the door opened and Rachel appeared. Her gaze darted between her mother and Margaret, confusion shadowing her features. "Mom! What's going on?" Barbara's voice cracked as she spoke. "This is Margaret Bennett." Rachel froze, her breath hitching. "Mrs. Bennett?" Her voice was tentative, tinged with wariness. She stepped closer to her mother, placing a protective hand on Barbara's shoulder. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. She's protecting her, Margaret thought, and for a moment she saw herself in Rachel, a woman trying to shield what little she had left. "I came to talk," Margaret said, her words directed at Barbara, but carrying the weight of decades. "To settle things." Barbara let out a bitter laugh that dissolved into a cough. "Settle things? After all this time?" Rachel glanced between the two women, her confusion growing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Barbara sagged back into her chair, her shoulders slumping, as if the fight had left her. "Rachel," she began, her voice breaking, "there's something you need to know." Rachel frowned, her grip tightening on Barbara's shoulder. "What is it, Mom?" Barbara looked up at Margaret, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she said quietly, "but I did. I had an affair with Gabriel Bennett, your father." The world seemed to tilt beneath Rachel's feet. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped back, her hand falling away from her mother's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Barbara said, her voice cracking. "I didn't want you to find out this way." I didn't want you to find out at all." Rachel's hands trembled as she brought them to her face. Her eyes filled with tears, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. "You lied to me," she said, her voice shaking. "You lied my whole life." "I was trying to protect you," Barbara said desperately, reaching for her daughter. "From this. From them." Rachel took another step back, her gaze shifting to Margaret. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret hesitated, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "I suspected," she admitted. But the confirmation came later. Rachel's expression crumpled, her composure breaking. "Why did you come here?" she cried. "To throw this in our faces? To punish us?" Margaret flinched, but before she could answer, Barbara's voice cut through the tension. "She came because I was wrong," Barbara said firmly, "because I hurt her, and I need to apologize." The sincerity in Barbara's voice caught Margaret off guard. She looked at the woman she had resented for decades and saw for the first time not the woman who had destroyed her marriage, but a broken person clinging to what little she had left. "I hated you," Margaret admitted, her voice trembling. "For years, I hated you. But seeing you now, seeing Rachel..." She paused, her composure faltering. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I don't want to carry this anger anymore." Barbara nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I understand," she whispered. Rachel stood frozen, her emotions a tempest she couldn't contain. Margaret turned to her, her expression softening. "Rachel, I didn't come here to hurt you. I came because I see now that you've done nothing wrong. I was blinded by my pain." Rachel's tears fell freely, her voice raw as she spoke. "I don't know what to do with any of this." Margaret stepped closer, but kept her distance, her own voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to do anything right now. Just know that you're not responsible for what happened. None of this is your fault." The three women stood in silence, the weight of the past pressing heavily upon them. For the first time, though, there was a glimmer of something else. Understanding, perhaps, or the faintest beginnings of reconciliation. The air inside the small house was heavy with the weight of silence. Margaret's fingers twisted nervously around the edges of her shawl as she sat on the worn couch, waiting for Rachel to return from helping Barbara settle in the next room. The visit had begun with confrontation, but had shifted into something unexpected, a fragile moment of shared vulnerability. Now, it was time to say the words she hadn't imagined herself capable of uttering. The sound of Rachel's soft footsteps brought Margaret's gaze to the doorway. Rachel hesitated, leaning against the frame as though bracing herself for another blow. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but guarded. Margaret rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as though the weight of her emotions made her unsure of her footing. She met Rachel's wary gaze and took a breath that felt like it carried the weight of decades. "I came here today," she began, her voice trembling, "because I thought I'd come to terms with everything that happened, but I see now I haven't." Rachel's expression remained unreadable, though her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Margaret's hands tightened around her scarf. "I've spent years letting bitterness dictate how I see the world and how I treat the people in it. I hurt you, and I hurt my grandson, all because I couldn't let go of the pain your mother caused me." Rachel floated slightly, but Margaret pressed on. "But your mother apologized today, and, for the first time, I truly believe her regret is real. And that makes me realize how much I've held onto my own anger." Margaret's voice softened, breaking slightly. "Rachel, I was wrong. I judged you, not for who you are, but for where you came from. And in doing so, I robbed you and my family of something precious. I am so sorry." Rachel stared at her, stunned. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Margaret took a tentative step forward, her hand trembling as she reached into her bag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," she said, holding it out. "Sean drew it for you. He's missed you terribly." Rachel hesitated before taking it. Her fingers brushed the edges of the crayon drawing, her eyes widening as she saw the image of herself and Sean flying a kite. Tears brimmed in her eyes, spilling over as she clutched the paper to her chest. "Why now?" Rachel whispered. Her voice was shaky, but there was a thread of hope woven through it. "Why are you doing this now?" Margaret's gaze softened, her own tears welling. "Because I see now how much I've let my anger take from me. It's taken joy from Sean, from Jackson, and from myself. And because you deserve better than the way I've treated you." Rachel's resolve cracked, a sob escaping her lips as she lowered her head. Margaret moved closer, her hands hovering uncertainly before finally resting on Rachel's shoulders. "You don't have to forgive me," Margaret said softly, "but I want you to know you're welcome at the Bennett estate, anytime." Rachel looked up, her tears glistening in the dim light. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Margaret replied, her own voice breaking. "Just know that I want to make things right." Later, as they prepared to leave, Jackson approached Barbara in her chair. The older woman looked frail, but there was a calm acceptance in her demeanor now that hadn't been there earlier. "I'd like to help," Jackson said, his voice quiet but firm. "Financially, for your treatment." Barbara blinked, clearly surprised. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice raspy. Jackson shook his head. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Rachel. She's part of our family now, whether it's complicated or not." Barbara's eyes glistened, and she nodded slightly, her lips trembling as she murmured, "Thank you." The ride back to the Bennett estate was quiet, the hum of the car's engine filling the space. Margaret sat beside Jackson, staring out the window at the passing countryside. She spoke after a long silence. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson glanced at her, his expression softening. "I think she'll try. And that's all any of us can ask for." Margaret nodded, her reflection in the glass showing the faintest hint of a smile. For the first time in years, she felt lighter, as though the chains of her bitterness had finally begun to loosen. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in decades, she was ready to face it. The cemetery was quiet, the stillness broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The Bennett family stood together, their figures framed by the towering oaks that lined the path to Gabriel's grave. Margaret was the first to step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, as though each step carried the weight of the past she was finally ready to confront. Rachel lingered a few steps behind, her hand resting lightly on Sean's shoulder. Jackson stood beside her, his steady presence a quiet reassurance. Sean clutched the crayon drawing Rachel had carefully preserved, his small fingers curling around the edges as though it were a lifeline. The headstone was simple, yet elegant, engraved with Gabriel's name and the dates that marked his life. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, her emotions swirling, a tempest of grief, betrayal, and something she hadn't felt in years: release. Margaret knelt slowly, her fingers brushing against the cool stone. "Gabriel," she began, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "I've carried the pain of your betrayal for so long. I thought holding on to it would protect me and keep me strong. but all it did was build walls between me and the people I love. Her gaze softened as she glanced back at Jackson, Rachel, and Sean. I've hurt them and I've hurt myself, all because I couldn't let go of the past. She bowed her head, her tears falling freely now. I forgive you, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. The wind seemed to pick up then, rustling the leaves around them. Margaret let out a shaky breath, feeling as though a weight had been lifted, a burden she had carried for decades finally set down. Rachel stepped forward next, her movements hesitant. She looked at the headstone, her emotions a tangle of confusion, anger, and sorrow. This man, her father, had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand, yet she had never known him. I don't know who you were, Rachel said softly, her voice trembling, but I know what your choices did to my mother, to Mrs. Bennet, to all of us. She paused, glancing at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Rachel's gaze returned to the grave. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I can promise that your mistakes won't define me. I'll build my own life, one that isn't tied to the pain you left behind. Sean tugged at Rachel's hand, his eyes wide and serious. Can I put this here? He asked, holding up the drawing. Rachel smiled through her tears. Of course, sweetheart. Sean stepped forward and carefully placed the drawing at the base of the headstone. This is for you, he said simply, his voice clear and earnest. Miss Rachel and I made it together. Jackson moved to stand beside Margaret, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. It's over now, he said softly. We can move forward. Margaret nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. For the first time, she believed him. As they walked away from the grave, the weight of the past seemed to lift with each step. Sean skipped ahead, his laughter echoing through the trees as he chased a falling leaf. Rachel watched him with a wistful smile, her hand brushing against Jackson's as they walked side by side. Margaret trailed behind, her gaze fixed on the family before her. For so long, she had been consumed by bitterness, convinced it was her only way to protect herself. But now, seeing Sean's joy, Rachel's resilience, and Jackson's unwavering strength, she realized how much she had to be grateful for. When they reached the car, Margaret turned to Rachel. You've brought so much light to Sean's life, she said, her voice warm, and to mine, even when I didn't deserve it. Rachel's eyes softened, her tension easing slightly. Thank you, she said quietly, for giving me a chance. Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth she hadn't felt in years spreading through her. Let's not waste it. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, the Bennet family moved toward a new chapter, one not defined by the shadows of the past, but by the light they were determined to build together. Margaret leaned her head back against the seat, the view of the passing countryside a blur. For the first time in decades, her heart felt unburdened. She closed her eyes, the faintest smile gracing her lips as she whispered to herself, "It's time to live again." If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.